All right, everybody. If anybody's here, we've been waiting for like an hour, but Charlie finally made it, and it's always tricky talking to Australians because they're so
Yep,
far ahead of us in time.
15, and it's not a simple one. It's 15 hours. That's
It's a
so much.
crazy. It's crazy, but I'm glad.
Mm,
I'm glad we're doing this, Charlie, because a lot of the times that we've mentioned to each other that we should talk about things, we never actually got to do it just because of the time.
yeah, definitely. Time and
So
baby as well.
and baby. Yeah, I don't have a baby, but you know what?
No.
I lately, for some strange reason, I've been having these weird dreams that I have a baby, but I keep forgetting that I have a baby. And I'm like, where did I put it? I don't think I fed it for like 3 days. I don't think babies would let you forget them, but in my dreams,
No.
I've forgotten them. They're horrifying.
Yeah.
Okay, so Charlie and I had a little discussion on the Voxer yesterday, and he shared a quote with me that I'm going to read, and we're going to try to talk about it to the best of our ability because it's a pretty substantial. And this is written by a friend of Charlie's. Do you want to
Mhm.
tell us who he is, or do you want to keep that private?
We'll keep it private. We can call him the Pilgrim
The
if we
Pilgrim.
need to refer. If we need to
That's
refer to somebody,
that's
he.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Such are traditions of my craft. Oh, do you want to say what his craft is?
He makes notebooks.
So he makes paper?
So he takes the paper, folds, like makes the books. He
Okay.
sews them together, sands covers out of hardwood,
Oh,
naturally
nice.
dyes some of the materials, carves and does his own lettering. He's learning uh, ancient Norwegian at the moment,
Okay.
and like carving and learning how to gild and things like that.
Okay,
So
cool.
as well as like, yeah, so he makes notebooks. He studies the history of them and the different techniques and stuff like that.
All right. Okay.
And
So
he's an ecologist, which will definitely come through.
okay, yeah. Okay, here we go. Such are traditions of my craft. I mean, the path I am finding, not the one I follow. They are new to me, yet tied up with older matter, known since water was given a name by people. The word tradition occupies me. Are traditions in a craft much more than conventions tried across generations until they hold more than can be understood at once, and in some places formed into a unique branch? I find it hard to agree with views that do not arrive near this conclusion. But my sentiment may be a cry, simply, for the paradoxes of tradition to be discussed. The idea of tradition creates a tension with how we work now, where some can say tradition and mean adjective of rarity. I too am caught in this habit of meaning tradition as both the real way, the quality way, but the different way. But different to what? And thus sometimes the fading way. Invoking a traditional method may only expose the paucity of convention. Should we ever keep a convention that is not fit for the traditions of our children? My desire is to have traditions as living things themselves, for to follow them otherwise eventually removes essential parts of the practice. But this is just what happens all too quickly when they are taken as dead. So there's that massive quote.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I find it just incredible, actually.
Yeah, he's
Some,
such a good writer.
some of the,
Sorry, I missed that bit.
yeah, some of the things that I'll just point out some of the things that jump out at me.
Mm,
Um, some of the things that jump out at me
Mhm.
first in here, much more than conventions tried across
Mhm.
generations. That's one. And
Mhm.
then he says his sentiment may be a cry simply for the paradoxes of tradition to be discussed, which is what we're
Yeah.
doing
Well,
here.
I
So that's
think
kind of interesting.
to me, the thing that like the first the thing, the path
and
that I'm
also
finding.
um,
That's
the path that I'm finding.
The path that I'm finding, I think, is sort of like
Can
the
you hear me?
real. Yeah, I can hear you. Tradition versus traditionalism. Yes, Oswald. I think there's this. It is.
Okay.
There's a humility. Can you hear me? Upside down internet.
I hear you.
Yeah, great.
I think we have a lag, but
Yeah, I think it's about. I think
yeah,
it's a
I
good
think so
couple of
too.
seconds. um, yeah, that's probably
Maybe it's
Australia,
back.
not.
No.
um, but I'll just go
No,
first
it's
because I
probably
think it's the
me.
first one.
My
Like,
connection. I had some connection issues this morning. Yeah,
where I'm on the other side of the world though, it's okay. I'm on an upside down land. But the idea of like the tradition that I'm finding, not the one that I follow. Um, he like he like this will be only because it's coming from me, who's known him for a long time. But he grew into becoming a notebook maker very naturally. Like both of us just have an intense love for writing and stories and creative ideas, fantasy and stuff like that. Like our original obsession was stationery. We would love drawing, so we would go to art shops and buy the fancy pencils and buy the exquisite paper and stuff. And then he would literally like go like, okay, I need a notebook. So he would fold pages together and then give it a cover, and that would be how it started. And then he slowly grew like this. He slowly grew into this product that is hands down like the best notebook ever. Like I love them. There's so much in it that is of what we did with them. Like the notebooks are large, with big margins that have little slots, of elastic that you can slide pencils in. So it's the only thing you need, and you can go traveling just with a notebook and then just take out a pencil and start writing. Um, but I think there's like, after a while, he sort of realized it's not just he's not just doing something that like is to fit his own, um, idea. Like the notebook is a tradition. The notebook has like a very large history on methods and methodologies, and all of those reasons sort of like become self-evident when you study them. And like over the time of him actually just trying to make a better and better product, but specifically with his hands, he he runs into this sort of place where he's not inventing things. He's discovering things. He's finding a path of a tradition of something that he actually like is a part of. Like
yeah.
I always encouraged him to use tools like power tools and just zing 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 zing, and then just bring them up. And he's like, no, it's like the process, it was the process. There's something necessary about the process, worth pursuing in and of itself.
Should I go now?
Back to you.
Terrible. I don't know why my internet's so crappy.
It's okay.
Okay, well, I mean, I can relate. I just listening to you talking about all of that, I can relate to it in the sense that I work with fiber, and I mean, I'm right from the raising of the animal to shearing of the wool, and then processing it, and then spinning it and turning it into something. And I mentioned this to you earlier that I actually decided to participate in that whole process. Like I could have bought wool that's ready to spin and done that, but I wanted to do all of it because I actually wanted to enter into an ancient mindset, because it felt like I would be walking on a path that many feet have walked on, something like that. And it would give me some kind of consciousness that I couldn't experience any other way. Like when you and I were talking about this, we were also talking about translating poetry, right? And separate from one another. But I made the observation that it's been on my mind recently because of my experience with wool. What if I did that with poetry? So what if I put myself on that path and walked with Coleridge or Shakespeare or the many others that we're familiar with.
I see that as like one of those
used some of their tools, and so the tools for a poet are
you get it.
Okay, I'll go. So like tools for a poet would be words, right? So how do you trod the same path of Coleridge, for example? You can't dress up and act like him for the day, and that's not gonna do the trick, right? So you have to use the tools that he used, which would be to use his language, having to deal with the imposter syndrome thing, like, okay, so am I just repeating something that's already been done? Where is originality here? Because this is the paradox of tradition, I think, that your friend is talking about, right? Where you take an old art and you practice it, but you're not in an old art setting, right? You're in the very now. So I guess my question is that how would you do that as a poet?
So I think it's all right. The delay we have is like 8 seconds long. I think when we think about language, we get too caught up in words. Like when I was reading in McGilchrist's book, The Master and
Mm.
His Emissary, and one of the things that my partner pointed out was that like all of the language centers of the brain are in the left hemisphere, and but that's because that's only where the words are. The areas of the brain in the right hemisphere that light up are multi-purposeful, and they are related to music. And I think a lot of the time when we step into uh, when poetry is used as a tradition, we think about it in we think about it sometimes in the sense of taking on a form with a certain language, but it's very hard, I think, because we also don't know how to listen to the music of that form. And I think when we think about the tools of the product, like we wouldn't like a lot of the reason why like most traditional methods are dead is because when you look at it, you're like, I don't even know how to use like a screen press, or, you know, something that's even relatively modern. And it's because we don't we don't get to involve ourselves in the process. But I would say like with poetry, there's there was a different reason, because like there was a different reason to listen to a poem than there is now. So it feels stranger like in poetry and poetic translations, not because we
Okay.
can't do it, but because the way in which what the poem is seems to be a different thing now. Because poetry seems to me like it's um it's a cache system for emotions. Like it's a way like you would memorize a poem to sort of go like, this is this feeling, this is this capture. I want everybody around this room to feel to be part of this story. It's a way to bring memory into a shared thing, which is why it was always, you know, related to celebration, consecration, mourning, or instantiation. Whereas to now, like it is, and I love modern poetry, but they are they seem less they seem more like things than they are like, I don't know, maybe I don't know, what would you consider to be what a poem was meant to be in Coleridge's time?
Well, here's where my education really fails because I didn't have one. But uh, well, I think people related. Well, first of all, I think they were sung, um, or and they were long and, you know, ballady type things. At least Coleridge. Um, so they were songs.
There's like I agree with you, but I also think that there was like I think was a song was something that was designed to get the listener to project their experience onto the music and to remember that feeling. Like um, Peugeot and Andreev years ago, music is used for two things. It's for religious memorization, which is, in my mind, internal transformation, and ecstatic influence. Like meaning like getting out of your body. like into dance, into movement, into sort of places where you forget yourself. And those were the two original roles of music. And I think poetry was that as well. Like, no, like poetry is sung now, but it's music. It's not called poetry. There is another thing that exists now called poetry, and it is spoken, and it is sort of emotive. And I do think it is still speaking to something ancient. I think, to me, what I see where I see poetry different to songs is, I see poetry as like this, well, ancient poetry. I see as like this intersection between song and story, where you have the musicality. Like, sometimes when the music goes,
Right.
you can start to forget the words. But with a story, you actually have to have, like, you have a little bit more of an awareness around it. And to me, like, poetry plays with the two kinds of language. Like, poetry plays with the words, the necessity of the net, the grounding portion, but it also plays with the music. And that's how you can go from one line and then sort of be sunk into the next. The interesting thing I think about this, though, is why tradition seems to have a lot of, like, importance. Because as some, like, I don't write to a school, or I don't write to a in the style of, or anything like that. I just write and I experiment and I play. But I do it very differently than what I did before when I was performing poetry, because I think the like, as my poetry grew, what I was trying to do originally was I was trying to understand I was trying to understand how I felt about something. And the more and more I sort of involve myself into poetry, the more I'm trying to separate myself from the poem, or like take these instantiations and try to treat them as separate to myself. And this is why I think it goes back to the Pilgrim's comment on tradition as dead things. Because or your experience with fabric, like, if you wanted it merely for
Yeah.
your own ends, you could have just bought a shirt. And if I really wanted just to understand my own feelings, I could just put on, I don't know, some Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Like, and there's an internal process that happens with doing something not only by yourself, but doing something in an old way, that, in a paradoxical kind of sense,
Right.
is an emptying of yourself.
Want me to go now? 8-second delay. That's crazy. Okay, so I want to talk about the deadness, because I think that's really interesting. And what's interesting to me about it is, because I'm thinking about about crafting, like your friend making notebooks, me spinning, and I'm also thinking of crafting a poem at the same time, because I think that I can do that. I'm giving myself license to do that. And so some of the practices that he's talking about with his craft are dead, right? People are not doing them anymore. And so he has to dig them up and revive them. Like he has to resurrect. And I think that as to metaphor. And that's what we have as poets to work with is metaphor, right? So we have nowadays, we have all these dead metaphors. And it's because we're not living in a way that gives us the ability. And I don't really understand why. Like, I'm not saying I have any answers here, but in a sense, we're not able to breathe life into the words because the metaphors are dead. And so we have to resurrect those metaphors. And so this is why my question is, do we do this? Do we, as you know, in poetry, do resurrect metaphors by entering in a and utilizing some of the tools that, such as words and lyrical, rhyming schemes or whatever? Is that how you are able to breathe life into those words? Like, I'm not saying you want to do, repetition.
Mm.
I mean, all of our creative abilities are a process of recombining, right? Recombining things that
sub-creation
are already given. And I talked about this in the Imagination series because this is how George MacDonald would phrase it. Sub-creation is what Tolkien calls it. Yeah. So as like I'm really asking the question. I'm really wondering, and if anybody listening has any suggestions, I would love to hear them because I just know, like, if I sit at my spin single that I've spun by hand, I can imagine what it felt like to have discovered that technique. Why? Because the Navajo invented it. And why did the Navajo invent it? Because they probably didn't have two bobbins. So they only had one, and they had to figure out a way to fly it, right?
Mm.
Which is to take two singles and make them
And that's the natural
together.
Yeah.
So when I Navajo ply, I feel like I can enter into a part, at least, of what it meant to be a Navajo person processing their own fiber, right? So if I was to take the tools of Shakespeare, let's say, and utilize some of his rhyming schemes, or some of even his vocabulary, or tread the same path, right, of reason within the poetry, because there's always that in the poetry, right, that's happening. Might not be apparent. Does that give me an opportunity, let's say, to change my consciousness? Just as I changed my consciousness when I practiced ancient art, like spinning.
Like, it reminds me of the Beowulf series that Richard Rowland is sort of going through with the symbolic world, because it's almost like by looking at this poem and going incredibly deeply into it, you can understand the life of what it is to be a Celtic Christian in the edge of the world, where they're making sense. Like, you kind of feel it when they're talking about the poem, like they're bringing it up to like, oh, this is where they've understood the Hebrew tradition. This is where you can kind of see an Enochian scripture. And I think it is not just, I think with poetry, it is about understanding the metaphor as well. Like when you said it, it just reminds me, I constantly find myself when I say a different word, when I say like a rare word or a complex word, and someone goes, "Oh, and honestly, they're not even complex anymore." And I say, I explain it, and they go, "Oh, why didn't you just say that?" Like I just go, because there's a different that this image has a different meaning. There's a different connection to it, and it's very hard because it feels like people go like, well, the world is so complicated, let's make it simpler. And in making the world simpler, you're losing. It becomes, it just shrinks. It doesn't become less simple, which is actually interesting because I think when you like to step into the tradition of a 14th century poet, I think it is about understanding the nature of what it means, like in the same way that a craftsman had a job where there's a humility of not needing to connect your identity or not needing to have your identity front and center. You're putting the poem or you're putting the craft front and center. You're giving your life through the craft, and through the craft you'll be seen, but it's a giving away that
Yes.
You go.
Yeah. Well, this is what you talked about earlier, right? This kenosis, this emptying yourself into it. It's a sacrifice, and you do that with any kind of ancient art because it's the thing with them is convenience. When you were talking about simplifying vocabulary, for example, it's just convenient for the listener. They don't have to think, right? It's, oh, I know what that means. And so we're in this world of convenience, which hasn't made our lives simple, like you said, right? Actually has complicated it. When you flip that over to crafting, for example, like your friend, what he's doing takes more time than it would to whip out a power tool or go to the store and buy a notebook, right? It takes more time. And so in what I was thinking about was that it embodies the sacrifice, right? The time that you do the sacrifice, that is your sacrifice to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can live apart from you. Like you were talking about earlier, you were saying how I remember listening to Malcolm Guite one time talking about how poetry nowadays, he described it as like the person is locked in a mirrored room. Right? So they're not talking about the world around them. They're just talking about themselves. Most of the that was his analysis. And so if you take the time to sacrifice to the thing, right, to empty yourself into it, I think that is actually breathing a life into something. So giving something a life of its own, right? Which I think is what you were hinting at previously, unless I got that wrong.
So there's this interesting thing that me and the Pilgrim are actually sort of like going back and forth about in regards to my poetry, because I like this idea of trying to appreciate and understand a poem as a living thing. And one of the coolest things that we're going back and forth on is we're documenting my poetry like a flora and fauna species. So we give them the common name, which is the title of the poem, whether I gave it the title ages ago or just made one up for it after the fact. But we're giving the title to a poem, but then on top of that, we're giving it a Latin name, like to document the phylogeny of it, to understand of it. And it's really interesting to look at poetry in a way that you have to classify it in Latin, because when I talk about it, it's the reason they use it is because it's so tightly self-referential that you can rely on it. And in that reliance on it, that's why it's that secondary name. It's not for common use, it's for referential use. It's for making this creature or this species be linked to others, and how you can understand how they share DNA. And I think that's really cool. And I think it's actually really interesting when we think about old versus new, because in a way, thinking about it as you were kind of already talking about it, it's not correct to think about these ideas and concepts as not in front of us, not in our actual world. Ancient ways of thinking are not things that are something being old, something being 10,000 years old is not the same as it being 10,000 miles away.
Right.
There is actually there is a presence to it that is just not seen. It's just not observed. And I think there's a reduction in a highway, in the sense that we've lost the ability to want to understand not only our language but other languages. And also I think in the low way, in the sense that we no longer trust people to be crude or informal. And I see that as in a sense as this is the start. This is why poetry always ends up dying. That guide quote of "in a room of mirrors" is so true, because I do love a lot of poetry, and there are some poets that I won't put into this category, but I might throw my community under the bus for a second. So many of the great poems are just about how people feel, and the trauma that they have experienced or overcome. And to me, I think there is something about the emotions. There is something about someone's own emotions are the base layer of reality, because that's how we experience it. Before we think about something, we feel it, and that's all we have left, because that's the middle of it, because and by being in the middle of it, it becomes the most important thing. And it's it's so hard in my mind to go because the advantage you have with that is that you now get to relate to somebody. This is why suffering is the universal in the world. People can connect with emotions because they're the central sensation, but the the interconnected nature that you actually have to have with somebody in order to be able to express poetry in the same way as the Beowulf poem was expressed. In a similar way, it's kind of like how there's like millions of notebook shops, but no notebook makers, because after a while, like, people are going to get their thing one way, and when they get their thing one way, they no longer need the other avenues. They no longer need the interconnection. They no longer need
Right.
they know the craftsman no longer needs the paper mill, and the paper mill no longer needs the forest ranger, because there's this guy that has this contract that goes all the way over here, and it's all disconnected from people. And it's kind of strange because, like,
Right.
all right, so this is an interesting question. So the tradition is alive because the person dies in it? Is that what happens?
Yeah. So, like I said, all of these ancient arts take time, right? And so, if I didn't have the time, I couldn't process my fiber the way that I do. So I have to choose. I have to choose between time and money, you know, which is really always the choice.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see over the years. And so I have to give up something in order to spend time, right? And so I do. I mean, my husband would say I die to it because I spend hours, right, working with my fiber and in various ways. And so, and if I don't do that, then that art dies. It dies with me, right? Like, this is why in First Nation culture, a lot of things have been lost when the elders died. Like I mean, you see this, right? Because a lot of tradition in First Nation culture is being lost by death. So, and I would say that it's because the young people aren't willing to die to keep it alive. That's why. So I do think that in order for the thing to be alive, you have to die, right? And so something came to my mind now, and I'm trying to think of. Well, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I think that's true. I think that's very true.
Yeah, I'll expand on that because
yeah. So I want to get back to this quote really quick because there was.
Oh, go back to the quote. Don't worry about the delay.
Okay. I'll just wanted to talk about. He says, I find it hard to agree with views that do not arrive near this conclusion. The conclusion being
the conclusion being that tradition is an organic,
our traditions
living thing, like a tree.
Conventions, right? Tied to. Right. Okay, exactly. Yeah. So he says, but my sentiment may be a cry simply for the paradoxes of tradition to be discussed. So Can you expand on that, on what he's talking about, the paradoxes of tradition? Because I think I know what he means, but I just want to hear it from you.
So the paradox of tradition, meaning the form that is given, or the nature that is given, like the traditional language of Australia is English, but the problem being the fact that traditional is actually the least common way in which we experience most of life. Like, we don't experience, oh, well, this is a traditional song, this is the traditional way that it's been given, because everything is not, everything is about separating itself away from how something was done. Like, the entire idea is, this is revolutionizing that, and this is revolutionizing that. And so the traditional notebook is one that was made by hand, in the same way that the traditional bed was the one that was made by hand. The tradition gets lost because even though maybe how you made a bed in the 17th century was different to the medieval times, so on and so forth, there was a lineage, there was a way in which it naturally grew and passed to each other, that when factories were made and factories were improved, they're not passing on information, they're sort of going, well, what if we do this entirely different again? What if we just throw everything out and don't take what we've been given and try to improve it? What if we just discard and go, all right, what else can we, like, how we can revolt it? Like, to me, that's what it sees. Like, when people say, like, oh, this is a traditional thing, it sounds rare, but tradition as a word, it's meant to mean the thing that is the stuff that you've been given. It's the stuff that we have. So, like, the paradox is we've been given a fake, but we treat the fake thing as if it's real. And through that, people just, there is a disconnection. Hello.
Okay, well, oh,
what did you think?
I thought, because he talked about after that, he said, yeah, okay, he did talk about the idea of tradition meaning rarity. I don't know. I for some reason, what I understood there was, because he talks about passing on tradition to his children. So he says, invoking a traditional method may only expose the paucity of convention. Should we ever keep a convention that is not fit for the traditions of our children? So I think he switches those two words in there, right? And like, what is the tradition of the children, and what is, how does he feel about convention? Because I'm wondering, the question here is how you hold on to, and that's what I had in my mind when I heard it.
Mm-hmm. I see that. I don't know if I talked about this with the Pilgrim or not, but I see that as sort of this kind of accepted tragedy that really didn't exist before, of like being a parent and teaching a child how to grow up in a world that they won't know. Like, my parents couldn't have predicted how the world was going to be when I was born.
Ooh.
and that was only 30 years ago. And like in my lifetime, I can see how radically different the world is now. And I would
Yeah.
say it's been like that for a long time, because people have just gone to the new thing and then to the new thing and to the new thing. And I think that's what he means by the convention, because we're not, it's not really, we're not really thinking about it. We're just kind of doing it because it's easier, it satiates us, it's simpler, it complicates our life less, you know. Like you said, it makes it only, like, now all we need is money. um and
Yeah.
I think that, um well, I mean, I know that that wasn't always the
Yeah.
case. Like, we parents were like, I think I'll always defiantly stand on this. I think parents were once able to be able to tell their child what their world is going to be like, and how to prepare the way for them, and how to go, look, this is what it's going to be. And I mean, I think we can do it to a certain extent. I'm sure, like, you've done it in a certain way, but in I'm sure other ways you've looked at the world and gone like, oh, I did not expect this.
Yeah. That, that's a really that's real those terms. But while you were talking about it, I was thinking of how, when they built a cathedral, you know, their children would grow up and become masons and build on that same cathedral, and their children and their grandchildren, because it took
Mhm.
hundreds of years, right? And so everybody kind of knew what
Yeah.
was what life was going to be like for generations. And yeah, yeah,
It's a paradox, because, one second, just gonna get
so
through
okay,
here.
so
Maybe this will be a bit better. Um,
we still have a lag. I'm just wondering if Wi-Fi's
might have a
connection's
bit better one now. Is that better?
I don't know how much of a lag there is.
It was like, my guess was 16 seconds before, so it was getting pretty high
Is it
up
better?
there. Yeah, maybe I'm on Wi-Fi now, so maybe it was me. No,
Yeah, who knows? Who knows?
I think.
Okay, well,
I think that there's something to be said about,
you go.
like, I think there's something to be said about what happens, what the process of actually giving a tradition actually is, and how that might have changed over time, and how, like, in a traditional way, there is an ethic that gets lost or goes away. And, like, I mean, I say this because I think that there's so many things that you could choose to preserve in a craft or in an art. I work with a lot of ballerinas, or like ex ballerinas, and they all do different things. And the world that they were talking about was, it's horrifying, it's ruthless. Like, they expect women to be like the most ultimate athletes, but at the same time not look strong. And, like, there's like conventions of image in certain ways, and there's
and like on top of that, there's also just the simple connection of like, you're probably going to have to be uncomfortable, and the risk of that discomfort being a permanent injury isn't zero. Like I think of like I think of like my own craft, which is hospitality. After COVID, we had a massive exodus on what I was like of like workers, because we all kind of like felt worthless and useless, and we would rather not feel that way. And what's happened is not all the bars closed down, and they've had to stay, they've kept open. And the people that have come in, they don't want to give themselves in the same way to the craft. Like they will take weekends off. They will ask to go home early. They will say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Like, and I do feel like a bit of an old man in saying it, but I was like, I mean, I've dealt with abuse. I've dealt with the most menial nonsense tasks. I've been put under stress and under pressure for it. And there is this interesting thing of like, I do not know what part of what I had to do, like what menial job or what sort of, you know, head knocking in, what part did I have to do, and what part wasn't necessary. And that to me is like one of the things that people are when people think about tradition, that's the thing that they throw away the first. They decide themselves what is necessary. And like, I mean, in some ways, I think it's right. Like, let's break it into something simple and not about people. There's like a traditional way to make an old fashioned is to muddle a cube, add bitters, and like make it dissolve naturally. And then you slowly build your liquor in side by side, bit by bit. And now we just dilute the syrup and then add this and then add the ice and then bang, cocktail. Tastes the same in some ways. But I feel like but there is something lost. I think the problem though is looking at is thinking that there is only a relationship between the creator and the created. Like the problem I see, like, or the vanishing thing, like I see there being an unreasonable, like I see there being, we talk about the relationship between the art and the person, and that's it. But I feel like the reason that we dealt with the suffering of our tradition or of our art for the majority of the time was actually because we knew it was understood and appreciated by others. And that the fact that dwindles, the fact that people don't appreciate poetry or handmade objects to the point that, you know, they like, I mean, or ballet or dance or art, it diminishes naturally. And the more it diminishes, the more people go, well, why are we doing it like this?
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting because there is like in order to appreciate, to be the appreciator of these things, you have to take the time to do that. And also to be the maker of those things, you have to have time. You have to have time for all of it. Like life is just too damn fast, I think. And I think it's because, I mean, I might have reduced it to this and it might be too reductive, but I think it's because we're so caught up in convenience that we're just constantly running towards it. Like I just see a large crowd moving towards the 7-Eleven. The convenience
I was listening to
store, right?
I was listening
and so the question always becomes, well, why would you bother doing it like that? It's so
it's there was this, like, Peugeot talked about it as like time destroys space, and the more you try to quicken time, the more it destroys space. And he said it was like, just imagine cars. Like, before we had cars, we had so much more space, and the more cars we have, the more roads we have. And not only like does it actually like invade our space, not only does it invade our space, it actually physically destroys it. Like, it's not just like, oh well, it's more convenient to drive there. And I was just like, yeah, what's happening? What's causing that? What's making that? And not only does like more convenience, like, it's the same with like that whole idea of like the language thing. It was like, why couldn't I just say it in a simple way? And it's like, that's like, I could say it in a simple way, but that doesn't make it simpler. Like, there is nothing a convenience store actually does that is truly more convenient than an older method, than a more than a more sort of prepared and patient life. It's strange, because I feel like the answer is like always going like, people go, oh, it's more convenient. We should really just go, yeah, it's about the same.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go here soon, but I just wanted to relate one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking. I have a draft horse on the farm, and when I first got him, he was ready to be trained for pulling wagons and sleds and whatever. And I had an old timer come and visit me. He was actually, his father owned our place in the 30s. And so he grew up here, and he came to visit, and he decided he was good with a wagon. And then he had to fit his harness. I didn't have a harness at the time. So he had to fit his harness on my horse. And that took him probably three hours, okay, of just meticulously walking around the horse and adjusting little things and making a new hole. And he just was so slow. It wasn't because he was old. He was old, but it wasn't because he was old. He was a very fit old man, actually. He still did all his own farm labor with a team of draft horses, and he lived with no electricity. Okay, so you know, I'm like, okay, come on, let's go, let's hook him up, let's see what happens, you know. And it was just taking forever, and finally he said, okay, now we can go. And we went down our driveway, which is a mile long. We got to the end of my drive horse, and he said, okay, let's have lunch. And I was like, what? But he said to me, now the horse has to think about that. He's got to think about that so he can do the rest of the journey. And then you know, we drove this horse all the way to his place, and his place was, I don't know, 35 kilometers away, and it took us 9 hours to get there. Okay, because he would every now and then he'd just stop and say, okay, we're going to take a break, you know. And there was nothing terrible happened. Nothing terrible happened. The horse didn't react badly. He had the horse for the summer. I got him back. He's been the best. He's been the kindest, the gentlest, the most. And it was because Gordon took time and he didn't rush, right? You take time and you don't rush, and it lasts forever. And that's exactly what's happened with my horse. It has lasted forever. And I just want to bring it back to poetry, because the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner has lasted forever, okay, and will last forever. But all this, you know, I don't even know what they call it. What, slam poetry? It's not going to last forever. You know, it's just not. And yeah. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to wrap it up with that. Do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah. Just on that, just to close it with that, I think the reason why giving your time is the same as giving yourself
Yes.
is the reason you need to actually rest as well. Like, I feel like the reason why ballerinas always end up injuring themselves, or there's always this fear and this danger of people breaking and killing themselves for their art. Like, the thing is, yes, you are going to kill yourself in your art, but you're also going to live. And I think people don't think about tradition as living things in that way, where it's like, oh, you just wasted all of your time giving yourself to this art. It's like, well, if you do it slow enough and you do it attentively enough, I think you live. I think you live in that process. Like, I think, like you said, you find yourself into an ancient space, and it lasts forever because it's ancient. It's been there forever. I think that's a good way to end it. Terrible delay. 8 people are going to finish this, I reckon.
Yeah, that's oh, it's so terrible happening. But I'm glad we got to have this conversation, and I think that it should be continued. And
yes,
I hope we can do it with better Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
On my end.
I'll find a way to hardwire mine as well.
It's what we've been doing. Yeah, and what we've been doing tonight, just for everybody who's listening, is really has been an exploration. So if anyone has any ideas and thoughts and comments, please leave them below. Give us things to think about, and because I would really love to continue this conversation. I think this is an interesting way to talk about tradition, because we get caught up in either ors, and I hope that this conversation wasn't about ancient ways, ancient wisdom, ancient paths, and ancestral knowledge, I would say, right? And so hopefully we can continue the conversation at a later date, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much
for being here. And I'll say goodbye now. And good night, everybody.